get this thing up. There we go. Good morning. Ross said I should introduce myself. So my name is Rex Churchill, and originally from Newfoundland, and moved up here to Nova Scotia 1 year ago, along with my wife and daughter, Hazel and Kezia. And we already had a daughter and her family up here, and granddaughter, Kylie, Taves, and Gregory, and Audrey, hence the draw. And so we've been here about a year now, and I think that's probably enough about me, all I need to say about that this morning. I'd like to go ahead and get into our message this morning, but I will make a slight confession here, and that is that small pulpits intimidate me, and that's a small pulpit. I might be skinny, but I can't hide behind that. The other thing that makes me nervous is the sound of running water, but I think I can be excused for that because I spent a fair portion of my life living on ships, and generally if you live on a ship, you don't like the sound of running water. I spoke in a church once where they were getting ready for a baptismal service in the evening, and they were circulating water in the tank that morning. They also had a small pulpit. So I had a small pulpit in front of me and the sound of running water behind me. Wasn't good. Wasn't good. This morning we're going to be looking at James chapter 5, the first 6 verses. And we haven't read them yet, so I think we'll just read them to start out with. James chapter 5. Starting from verse 1. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. I don't know what you think of James' style of writing. Martin Luther didn't think much of his content, especially the second part of chapter 2. But James' style is distinctive. In a word, it's blunt. There's nothing subtle about James. It's also all over the place. His range of topics have about as much of a theme as a grocery list. It's all food, but that's where the similarity ends. But you also have to say this, it's intensely practical. In other words, this is where the rubber hits the road. In fact, speaking of where the rubber hits the road, I think of the book of James as a shop manual. Now, most people wouldn't know, today especially, what a shop manual is. But when I was young, I liked to work on cars, and every car had a shop manual that was issued by the manufacturer. And it would give step-by-step instructions on how to disassemble and reassemble just about everything on the vehicle. And James is, in a sense, like a shop manual. It's an instruction manual on living the Christian life. In this brief passage that we're considering this morning, James turns his attention to what appears to be a relatively small group of people, an exclusive group. Good. Yep. So, when we say the rich, this immediately begs the question, who are the rich? Who are the rich? What are the qualifications, or what's the definition that puts someone in this category? Sometimes it's probably rather obvious. I can think of one example for sure. I'm presently working on a contract with a company that's doing a refit on their offshore oil production vessel. It's in a shipyard in Spain, and I've been working there on 5-week stints. At the end of the first 5 weeks, back in May, Hazel came over to join me, and we had a couple of weeks holiday in Spain and the south of France, the latter part being something that we'd always wanted to do. It was a great time. We really enjoyed it. I'll show you my 700 pictures sometime. We spent a week in a place called Antibes, which is between Cannes and Nice. And the first evening we strolled down by the marina, which was close to where we lived, and I was amazed by what I saw. I wouldn't have thought that so many super yachts existed in the world. There were hundreds of yachts and super yachts. Now these boats are tens of millions of dollars. Antibes also happens to be the home port of the largest super yacht in the world. The name of the ship is the Dilbar. It's 157 meters long, 16,000 tons. It's owned by a Russian businessman. It cost $600 million to build. $600 million for a private yacht. I think we can safely say that these people are rich. But what else does the Bible say about the rich besides what James says? In Matthew chapter 19, then Jesus said to his disciples, I tell you the truth, it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Now, this was a real shock to Jesus' disciples and to their theology. It says, when the disciples heard this, they were greatly astonished and asked, who then can be saved? There was a popular belief that if God was pleased with you, then you would be materially blessed. But this wasn't something new. If you go back to the book of Job, then you will see that Job's 3 friends had the same idea. And the idea hasn't gone away yet either. We have within the borders of Christendom what we sometimes call the prosperity gospel. Of course, there are elements of truth in the teaching, as there usually is with false teaching. God certainly did promise material blessings to Israel if they would continue to follow and obey him. And Jesus also said that if we seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, then all these things would be added unto us. But it's a short distance between these truths and allowing our hearts to move towards a do in order to get theology. God is not a combination lock that we can punch in the right numbers and the door automatically opens. God doesn't only look at the outward actions and appearance. He looks, in fact, primarily at the heart and its motivations. Now, we should point out that while Jesus said it was difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, he did not say that it was impossible. Did I hear a sigh of relief? The fact is, there are very few people who can handle money well, and there are even fewer people who can handle a large amount of money well. Many Christians have the best of intentions in this area, but the gate and the pathway are narrow, and there are few who find it. Because money doesn't only change things, money changes people. If you read the Old Testament story about Lot, you will find the story of a contradictory and a compromised man. What makes the story even more challenging is that in the book of 2 Peter, it calls Lot a righteous man no less than 3 times. In Genesis, it says that Lot first looked towards Sodom. And then it says that he pitched his tent near Sodom. And then at some scripturally unannounced point, he obviously moved into Sodom. But the outcome of the story is that Sodom moved into Lot. And it's often the same with money. We should note that while Jesus did not say it was impossible for a rich man to enter the kingdom, he did say it was impossible to serve both God and money. James' words in this passage are particularly harsh. This is not a mild rebuke. This is an outright condemnation. Now, we can look at the world and easily find people who would, in our eyes, fit this description. But wait a minute. Earlier this summer, Mike pointed out that this book was written to Christians, not to unbelievers. Now, that's a little more uncomfortable. How are we going to deal with this in relation to this passage? Is it possible for Christians to behave like this? Well, look back for a minute to James chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, where he talks about showing favoritism towards rich people in the church. Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are slandering the noble name of him to whom you belong? The first book I read as a Christian was a book by Charles Sheldon called In His Steps. I'm sure some of you would remember. It's an old book, but I highly recommend it to you. It's fictional, but I would call it a true story. It's about a pastor of a church who was deeply challenged one day when a homeless man comes into his church and subsequently dies. And the pastor is very convicted by his own lifestyle, and after much self-examination decides that from that day forward he's going to govern all of his actions by the question, what would Jesus do? And this, of course, is the actual source of the acronym WWJD, which became popular again a few years ago. Well, this pastor soon finds that asking this question turns his world upside down, not to mention the world of those around him. And one of the many things he discovers is the contradiction between the business practices of some of the wealthy people in his church and the teachings of Jesus, which, as you can imagine, creates a great deal of friction. Reading this passage in James 5, as well as the verses we just read in James 2, reminds me of that story. And the answer to the question I just asked is yes, it is possible for people who profess Christianity to behave like this. Partly because of what I said earlier, that money changes people, but partly also because of our uniquely human ability to compartmentalize our lives into what we say and do in a Christian context and what we say and do in other contexts. The problem is that separation is not a divine one, it's a human construction. With God, there is no non-Christian context in the Christian life. If you're a Christian 24 hours a day, every day, and every part of our lives is an opportunity to prove it. And we do need to prove it, as the second half of James points out to us. But I think we have to come back to our original question again. Who are the rich? Are the rich just people who own super yachts? Perhaps we need to consider the question in terms of this statement. If you have food in your fridge, clothes on your back, a roof over your heads, and a place to sleep, you are richer than 75% of the world. If you have money in the bank, your wallet, and some spare change, you are among the top 8% of the world's wealthy. And I think this brings us a little closer to the intent of these verses in James, because it's easy to be dismissive about the verses and say, well, they don't really apply to us because not many of us here today would probably say that we were rich. But here's the thing. Rich is not an absolute word. It's a relative one. My family and I spent 6 years working with the Mission Operation Mobilization, during which time we lived on board their ship, the MV Doulos, traveling around Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. It was a very old ship. In fact, it was in the Guinness Book of World Records as the oldest floating passenger ship in the world. It was built in 1914, 2 years after the Titanic. It needed a lot of work to keep it going, and believe me, it was no cruise ship. But when people came on board from many of these countries that we were visiting, they thought it was the most incredible thing that they'd ever seen. And so it was, compared to much of their living conditions. It's not difficult to find people richer than us, but the truth is that most people in the world are much poorer than us. And relatively speaking, that makes us rich. So rather than trying to break down these verses into an analysis of each action that's being condemned, I think we need to address the intent of the passage, which I believe is to examine our lives and our lifestyles and see how they line up with the instructions that were given in the New Testament about dealing with what financial advisors like to call our net worth. No doubt, the content of this passage would indicate that there were some wealthy merchants who called themselves Christians, who at the very least were showing very poor stewardship of their resources, and at the worst were greedy and dishonest. But failure in financial stewardship is not limited to this group of people. and we would do well to take that to heart. Most of the church in the Western world has an appalling record of how much Christians give to God's work, typically averaging less than 2% of their incomes. We obviously listen a lot more to financial advisors of this world in our own hearts than we do to God's words. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9 deal extensively with the issue of giving, and Jesus often talked about money matters. It's all there for us to read. We've been told by some financial gurus today that our generation is financially illiterate. Seems that we baby boomers, including Christians, have done a lousy job of educating our children in finance. But it really isn't so complicated. We started our children with containers labeled giving, saving, and spending. How simple is that? Even as they grow older, we don't have to teach them anything more complicated than the acronym GAS, GAS. It stands for God first, avoid debt, and save. Most people today seem to go by the acronym OIL for oil. Overspend, in over our heads, live it up. I believe our generation is going to reap the results of this philosophy in a material sense. James certainly painted a bleak spiritual future for the ones he was addressing. But looking at his words, I suspect James was thinking primarily of the day of accounting that comes after death. But reaping what we sow is a law that is in effect in this present life too. But in contrast to the people that James is speaking to, we also have some examples of a very different philosophy. In 1731, John Wesley had an income of about £30 a year as a lecturer at Oxford University, which he spent entirely on himself. Then one day he found himself confronted with someone in need, and he had nothing in his pockets to give them. So he felt very convicted by this, and he started to limit his expenses. He started keeping a record of his income and expenditures and found that he was able to live on £28 a year. And so he had £2 which he was able to give away. The next year his income doubled, but instead of spending more on himself, he continued to live on £28, and now he had £32 to give away. The next year his income rose to £90, and he gave away 62. The next year it rose to 120, and he gave away 92. See, Wesley's philosophy was that with increasing income, what should rise is not the Christian's standard of living, but their standard of giving. Now, this is not a philosophy that you hear much of in the church today, at least not in our part of the world. Wesley continued to carry on this policy even when his income rose above £1,400 a year. In 1744, he wrote this: "When I die, if I leave behind me £10, you and all mankind may live and bear witness against me that I have lived and died a thief and a robber." I can't help but he was thinking of these verses we've just been reading in James 5. And there was certainly no such testimony against him in this regard. When he died in 1791, the only money mentioned in his will was the miscellaneous coins to be found in his pockets and in his dresser. He'd made an estimated £30,000 in his lifetime, and he'd given almost all of it away. John Wesley had 3 rules in regards to money: gain all you can, save all you can, give away all you can. In Matthew 6, Jesus addresses the same issue of accumulation of material wealth when he says this: "Don't pile up treasures on earth, where moth and rust can spoil them, and thieves can break in and steal them. But keep your treasure in heaven, where there's no moth or rust to spoil it, and nobody can break in and steal it. For wherever your treasure is, you can be certain that your heart will be there too." Now, the first sentence in these verses tells us 2 things. Number 1, we're directly told not to accumulate money and things. And number 2, we're told that if we do, we will also accumulate the stresses, worries, and expenses of looking after them. This is part of what Jesus called the cares and the concerns of this world when he talked about unproductive Christians in the parable of the sower. We can't escape the fact that time and money put into these things has to mean that it's time and money taken away from other things, which Jesus addresses in the second sentence. And the second sentence, again, says, "Keep your treasure in heaven, where there's no moth or rust to spoil it, and nobody can break in and steal it." This second sentence tells us 2 things as well. Number 1, we're directly told to invest in spiritual things. And number two, that this investment is 100% secure. Peter describes it like this: an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for you. If we had the opportunity to compare our property or possessions or our net worth here on earth with what we have accumulated in heaven so far, I wonder what we'd find. Would we be encouraged? Would we be dismayed? Would we be shocked? Would we make some different lifestyle choices? Now, the third sentence in these verses doesn't tell us not to do something, like the first sentence, and it doesn't tell us to do something, like the second sentence. The third sentence just tells us a fact. Wherever you put your time and money is where your heart is. That's it. Just a plain statement of fact. There's no good pretending otherwise. That's the way it is. The inference here is that I don't have direct control over where my heart goes. What I can control is where I focus my energies and resources, and my heart will follow that. 1 Timothy chapter 6 gives us very similar advice on this topic. After warning about the dangers of wealth in 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 to 10, Paul goes on to give what can be considered the antidote to the potential poison of material wealth. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up for themselves as a firm foundation a treasure in heaven for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. In the New Testament, we find that Jesus often talked about wealth, and we could certainly talk about it a lot as well. But if there's a final word to be said, it's probably found in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 8, or 2 Corinthians 8 rather, in verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich. And if you'd like to follow up with more reading on this subject, I'd recommend the book called Radical by David Platt. It's a book that challenges our lives and our lifestyles, but I think we need it.